It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting, either through my website, emailrevealer.com, or just email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. If you like our show, be sure and check out our members section. Not our members section. Be sure and check out our Patreon, Opperman Report Patreon. I put up exclusive content there every week, but also too all the stuff you hear Monday to Friday, AM, FM radio. You can get over there with the ads cut out, ad-free, commercial-free. Our archives you can find at Spreaker.com. And as a matter of fact, if you go to our archives and you Google in Spreaker there, Geoff Gilson. Geoffrey Gilson. It'll come right up. We've done many shows with him in the past. His book is called Maggie's Hammer, How Investigating the Mysterious Death of My Friend Uncovered a Netherworld of Illegal Arms Deals, Political Slush Funds, High-Level Corruption, Secret Role as America's Hired Gun. You can find him on his Facebook page, just as Geoff Gilson, which is Geoff Gilson. And then also at Ticker Tape Talk. If you Google Ticker Tape Talk with Geoff Gilson, you can find him there too as well. Mr. Geoff Gilson, are you there?
I am indeed, Ed. Good to hear from you. One quick correction. It's Geoff with two Fs. Oh. But other than that, delighted to be here and happy to be talking with you.
Excellent. Remind the audience, though, who is Geoff Gilson with two Fs?
Who am I? Good question, because we're going to be talking today about Ghislaine Maxwell. And the first thing that anybody's going to ask is, well, who is Geoff Gilson and what does he know about Ghislaine Maxwell? I am a 65-year-old British American. I was born and raised in England. Until the age of 32, I was living a quite normal life in a 12,000 population, reasonably smart town to the west of London. And then my life changed. This was 1988, when my best friend and political mentor, Hugh Simmons, CBE, turned up dead in some local woods. It didn't make sense. My career as a lawyer in my own regard was at an end, because the police and the Law Society, when a lawyer turns up dead, they want a scapegoat, and I was the one left holding, not unfortunately the checkbook, but the pan, and so I couldn't work in England anymore, and I needed to find out the truth. So I started asking all the right questions in all the wrong places. Went on a roller coaster for 27 years of investigation while holding down other jobs, and discovered all sorts of things about Hugh that I had not known, and discovered his connections with Margaret Thatcher and arms deals and Robert Maxwell, and laundering of money into Eastern Europe, and all of the matters which have got me interested in Ghislaine Maxwell and her verdict this week, because those of us who were paying attention after the verdict came across, if we didn't already know it, stories from an Israeli intelligence operative, former operative, called Ari Ben-Menashe, who was saying Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeff Epstein weren't just people peddling pedophilia, they were Israeli intelligence agents deliberately blackmailing people. And when I read this and read the details and watched the interviews with Ari Ben-Menashe, I realized that the modus operandum that was being described was exactly the same modus operandum that Ari had been describing to me between 93 and 98 when I was putting my book together.
Yeah, why don't we start with this? Why don't you describe first who Ari Ben-Menashe is and your relationship with him, and then what's his connection? How does he know about Jeffrey Epstein and all that?
Okay. As I said, the modus operandum he was describing was exactly the modus operandum that occurred in Great Britain. How did I come across Ari Ben-Menashe? By accident. My mate Hugh, he turns up dead, $7 million is missing, my life is over. I try and start investigating to find the truth and find out what was going on. If you buy the book, Maggie's Hammer, you can get it, find it on Google, it's very simple, maggieshammer.com. That will set out most of the details. Also, this week I wrote a post to update everything on my Facebook page. First post there, all the links, all the details are there. Essentially what I had to do, Ed, was this. I had to start with nothing. I had to go to his friends and then his friends' friends. And little by little, I discovered things. I discovered that he was, in addition to being he was 40, a successful lawyer. We already knew he was a rising star in the British Conservative Party. He was on their National Board of Finance. He was well known to Margaret Thatcher. In addition to that, he was also unknown to me, a senior officer within British intelligence, MI6, and a contract assassin for them, which was kind of a frightening thing to discover. But I discovered that from his partner in Scotland, who took a while to open up to me. I then started putting bits and pieces together, and I would literally read book after book, article after article, and contact people. And in 1993, out of the blue, I read a book by Ari Ben-Menashe called Prophets of War, and there was a paragraph in there which talked about the Israelis targeting Great Britain to stop it being so pro-Arab and pro-Iraq. And they specifically, in November 1988, had a list of people they were targeting for assassination. And I contacted Ari and I asked, "You don't know me, but..." And he said, "Ah, yes, we've checked the list. Your friend was on our list." And that's when we started talking.
Was he ever a suspect? Okay, and who is Robert Maxwell?
Okay, Robert Maxwell is very important because Ghislaine Maxwell, with the greatest of respect to her and your American audience who think that she's the be-all and end-all of everything, she is actually simply an adjunct of Robert Maxwell. It all began with Robert Maxwell and Ari Ben-Menashe in the 80s. Robert Maxwell was originally a Czechoslovakian emigre. His family were killed in the Holocaust in Czechoslovakia. He made his way to Great Britain. He was an Anglophile. He adopted a British accent. If you ever see any videos of him, he sounds like British upper crust. He became a billionaire with publishing ventures, primarily because he managed to link up with communist dictators in Eastern Europe and publish a lot of stuff for them. And he had strong links with Eastern Europe. And he was also a British Labour politician, and was in Parliament in the 60s, but essentially became a major donor to the British Labour Party. To be honest, I had no idea there was a connection between Hugh and Robert Maxwell. Originally, and Ari sort of reveals things in snitches and snatches, never all at once. If you ever see him interviewed, or you ever interview him, you will find that out. At first, he was talking about the British Conservative Party, which made sense. He was British Conservative Party, I was British Conservative Party, Margaret Thatcher. In the 80s, everybody and his uncle was selling arms illegally to Iran or Iraq because of the Iran-Iraq war, $60 billion to Iraq, $80 billion in weapons to Iran. British Conservative Party was doing that. Margaret Thatcher set up a little unit to do that. Hugh was the money man. That made sense. All of a sudden, in 95, Ari says, by the way, he was connected to Robert Maxwell. How? I was at meetings with him and Robert Maxwell. And that sounds very much like what was going on with Epstein. I was at meetings with him, and I said, okay. And he would never explain. When I pushed him later on, it made him very agitated. He didn't want to talk about it. So all I have is Ari's say-so that Hugh and Robert Maxwell were connected. Save for something, and Ed, you will understand this. At the moment with COVID, we have all sorts of crazies running around saying all sorts of things on video and in Epoch Times and the like, with not a shred of evidence, not a shred of verification. And I'm sure you won't mind my saying this. These are the people who make journalists and investigators like you and citizen journalists like me, they give us a bad name. Because if we had all the proof in the world, we'd be on the front page of the New York Times. We have to look in the dark corners, but we do the work. And these idiots on Epoch Times don't do the work. And people read them and they believe rubbish. What is the work? The work is being presented something like your interview this morning, seeing whether it makes sense. verifying it against other people, verifying it against what I say. Ari says something to me, I verify it with other things. There was one thing that Ari said that really made sense. He said, I met with your fellow in Robert Maxwell's office on several occasions. Normally, I'd have turned around and said, there's not a chance. There's not a chance. Hugh Simmons, rising star in the British Conservative Party, why would he be in the office of a major Labour Party donor, except for this? It's a silly story, but it's essential to understand in terms of this sort of thing generally. I was in Hugh's house sometime in the 80s. I was playing with his daughters who were 8 and 5. We were watching a stupid program on television, and the program was going into rooms of famous people, and you had to guess whose room it was. And we were looking at this very high-tech office, which in the 80s was different sort of high-tech, looking at this high-tech office in the 80s, and Hugh comes in and gets a drink, walks out, looks over and says, that's Robert Maxwell's office, and walks out. And I didn't think anything of it until Ari said, I met him in the office. How did Hugh know what Robert Maxwell's office looks like? All right, that is not something you can take to the bank, but it adds some credibility. So that's who Robert Maxwell was. What Ari told me Hugh was doing with Robert Maxwell. Robert Maxwell, this is from Ari, this isn't from me, this is from Ari. Robert Maxwell was an agent for Israeli intelligence. During the course of his life, he started off being an agent for British military intelligence during the war. Then he was allegedly recruited by the KGB. Then he was allegedly recruited by Ari. Certainly there is a lot of circumstantial evidence. There was an author called Gideon Thomas who wrote a book about Robert Maxwell's intelligence contacts. Don't take it from me. Go and do your own homework. That seems to be fairly well established. What Ari told me Robert Maxwell was doing was helping Israel's intelligence and the CIA to launder profits from the sales to Iran and Iraq of arms during the 80s. And somehow or another, Hugh Simmons was introduced to him. Hugh was already laundering money for the British Conservative Party from these arms deals, but he was recruited to sell arms to do the money laundering for Robert Maxwell and Ari Ben-Menashe. Why? Actually, money laundering is quite a specialized industry. Back in the 80s, not many people knew how to do it. Why Hugh? Hugh worked for a company called Wedlake Bell. Wedlake Bell. If you go online, they're a Tony firm in London. They call it tax avoidance and money management. But back in the 80s, it was money laundering. That's what Hugh did. And that's why he was working with Ari Ben-Menashe and Robert Maxwell.
No, but the death of Robert Maxwell, no one mentions it whatsoever in any of this Ghislaine Maxwell coverage. What can you tell us about the death of Robert Maxwell?
Well, it's important to understand because, as I say, this is where Ghislaine Maxwell comes up. Ghislaine Maxwell was nobody without Robert Maxwell. The only reason that she was targeted is because she was Robert Maxwell's daughter. Robert Maxwell was recruited by Ari Ben-Menashe for a number of reasons, but primarily because of the contacts in Eastern Europe. They needed somewhere to put hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal profit. You can't exactly walk down to your local Bank of America and bank it. Robert Maxwell had excellent connections with communist dictators in Eastern Europe who, even though they were communist, had banks. And that's where money could be lodged. And that's where Hugh and Ari and Robert Maxwell lodged the money. I know from the Law Society that Hugh had made trips to Eastern Europe. They hadn't found him at first, but they discovered. Can you hear that?
Yeah, I thought that was you. I thought you were fumbling with something.
I don't know what that is. I'm terribly sorry. I do apologize.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have to apologize to your listeners because you can get rid of it.
Yeah, I thought you were fumbling with something.
Okay, no. Somebody was calling me.
Okay.
Why it comes through, I don't hear. Okay. Robert Maxwell. Okay, let's try and pick up again. Bing, 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 bing. The main thing he was doing was laundering money into Eastern Europe. Okay. Here is the problem with that, and there are various stories. Robert Maxwell turned up face down in the Mediterranean in 1991. The CIA say it was the Israelis. The Israelis say it was the CIA. Nobody says it was MI6. Robert Maxwell and Hugh and Ari, between them, were in charge of the funds in Eastern Europe. It is arguable. One story says that Robert Maxwell stole the money to shore up his publishing interests in the United Kingdom, and the Israelis got angry. Another story is that he stole the CIA money and they got angry. No one really knows. The book by Gideon Thomas presents both versions. Ari would probably shrug and say it doesn't really matter. Robert Maxwell was diddling the money and he died. Ari said exactly the same thing about Hugh Simmons. I tried to force him on this when he said, he kept changing his story, but he said the Israelis didn't kill Hugh. I'm not convinced. But he finally said, look, the fact of the matter is your friend was doing things. He was creaming off the top, just like Robert Maxwell was doing. And he had annoyed enough people that somebody was going to bring his life to an end. Geoff, it really doesn't matter how Robert Maxwell or Hugh Simmons died. They died. Now, the important point about that is that at the same time that this was going on in England, and it took a while to get this out of Harry, I said, all right, I've got Hugh Simmons, money launderer. That's why you were doing business with him. But it seems to have been a bit more intimate than that. Why? And he said, okay, because everybody was making money in the 80s, but at the same time, what we were doing, what Israel was doing, was targeting the United Kingdom because we were worried about it politically. Why? The United Kingdom means nothing to Israel. He said, well, okay, let's break this down. First of all, you were the main arms suppliers to the Middle East. The United States at this time was not supplying arms to the Middle East because Congress wouldn't allow it. So you were the main arms suppliers. Specifically, you got into a deal called Al Yamama, which sold tens of billions of dollars worth of arms to Saudi Arabia, which we knew was sponsoring terrorism by the back door. So we weren't terribly happy about that. I said, yes, but okay, so we were selling arms to Iraq and you were selling arms to Iran. He said, yeah. Between 1980 and 1988, when the Iran-Iraq war was up and running, everybody was selling arms. Russians, Americans, French, German, English, Israelis, it didn't matter. Because basically these two countries, both of which were a threat to Israel, were killing each other. They were killing millions of soldiers, they were blowing each other up, and they were bankrupting themselves. We were happy. In 1988, there was a ceasefire. We stopped. You Brits didn't stop. You had decided you were going to go on supplying Iraq. At that time, he was the counterterrorism advisor to Yitzhak Shamir, and he was tasked by Yitzhak Shamir with stopping Britain supporting the Arabs. So he said, I was in England.
Oh, wait, is Shamir the one that was on Epstein's plane? No, that was Barack.
No, that was Barack.
Right, okay.
Shamir was a right-wing prime minister, and Harry was his counter-terrorism advisor. And Harry was specifically targeted to stop the sale of arms to Iraq. And I'm pausing for a second because I want to say something to you, Ed. There is no way I know how to stop this annoying bell, which means that somebody is trying to message me. Because I'm on microphone, you can hear it. I apologize.
Oh, no. We can't hear that at all.
Okay.
We're not hearing that at all.
I'm going to continue.
Yeah.
So he was tasked with stopping the what Britain was doing. This meant stopping the sale of arms, which is apparently why Hugh ended up dead. It means stopping the conservative tilt towards Iraq, which meant targeting senior British Conservative Party members and blackmailing them. And here's the point, Ed. This is where the modus operandum begins to sound exactly like what he's saying he was doing with Ghislaine and Epstein. Let's talk about what that blackmailing was looking like. First of all, he said he was blackmailing Hugh. He said, this is the classic thing. As soon as one of the people you're involved with is breaking the law and they're in the public eye, you've got them. Whether it's going to bed with underage children or whether it's selling arms to Iraq, or whether it's stealing money from your client's account in your law firm, once they're illegal, you've got them. So he had Hugh. And I said, but why were you targeting Hugh? And he said, because we recognise that Hugh, at the age of 40, was a rising star in the British Conservative Party. I said, okay, tell me about the British Conservatives. We said they were pro-Arab. He said, in 1990, Margaret Thatcher was removed as leader. John Major takes over. John Major's campaign manager and his primary lieutenant was a guy called David Mellor. He said David Mellor was openly pro-Palestine. Do you think we were going to allow that? Well, David Mellor eventually had to resign because he was caught having extramarital affair with a woman. And Harry said, we sponsored that. He said, I can explain to you exactly how we did it. We effected the introduction of her to him. We were the ones who secretly financed the Daily Mirror newspaper to bug the apartment. Of course, we didn't tell them we were Israelis. We told them we were something else. But we came up with the money because we had to target David Mellor. Now, Mohammed Al-Fayed. You know Mohammed Al-Fayed.
Yes.
I'm not going to spend a lot of time right now on this. If we have time, I'll come back to it. I can talk. It's in my book, Maggie's Hammer. Google it. But I did some research of my own. While Ari was wandering around England in the 80s, gaining assets, there was one that he never spoke about, Mohammed Al-Fayed. In my book, I detail how I discovered that in the 50s, Mohammed Fayed, as he was then known, he got rather poncy later on and called himself Al-Fayed, was growing up in Egypt next to the Suez Canal. I met and interviewed someone who was his best friend in the village. And Mohammed Fayed was known as a smuggler across the Suez Canal, which was then run by the British and the French. And this guy said it was well known that Mohammed Fayed was an agent for British military intelligence, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to smuggle. Along comes Nasser, 1956, the Brits and the French go, Egypt takes over. And what this guy said was, everybody, and I confirmed this with further research, all of the agents and assets that British military intelligence had in Egypt at that time, they handed over to Mossad. I pause. I absolutely have no proof whatsoever that Mohammed Fayed is an Israeli intelligence asset. All I know is that story and the fact that I've done considerable research, which is in the book, which shows that what Mohammed Fayed was doing in Europe after that, there's a remarkable resemblance to the agenda that Ari Ben Menashe was also pursuing in Europe. Mohammed Fayed...
Fayed is the brother or the brother-in-law of Adnan Khashoggi, correct?
Yes, he is, and he made his first money selling arms. Then he moved to England because he was another one of these people who liked to be English, and he wanted to be English, and he bought Harrods, and he bought the Ritz Hotel in Paris, which is important. He then got angry because the British would not, in the 80s, give him, or 90s, give him British citizenship because he was a sleaze. But he was well tucked into British society.
Yeah, don't forget his son was dating or engaged to Princess Diana.
I come to that.
Sorry.
Mohammed Fayed got angry with the British Conservative Party late 80s and early 90s because they would not give him British citizenship. And he announced, it's all online, you can find it, he announced boldly that he was going to expose the British Conservative Party and its arms dealing. Well, I'm quite excited. I thought I might actually learn something. I wrote to him a couple of times. He didn't answer. The first thing that he did was he nobbled a few British members of Parliament because he set up a scheme called Cash for Questions, where he bribed certain members of Parliament covertly to ask questions. One of those members of Parliament was known to me. He was my local member of Parliament. He had to resign. Again, I have no evidence that Ari Ben Menashe was running Mohammed Fayed. But it was exactly what Mohammed, it is exactly what Ari Ben-Menashe was doing, trying to target leading British politicians. The big one for Mohammed Fayed was a guy called Jonathan Aitken, who at the time that he had to resign was the equivalent of the US Treasury Secretary. Terribly important. He was also covertly heavily involved with the Al Yamama Saudi arms deal and was making a lot of money illicitly in commissions from the arms sales for which Hugh Simmons was laundering the money. And in 1995, it all caught up with him because Mohammed Fayed, as the owner of the Ritz Hotel, let it be known that Jonathan Aitken had been meeting in that hotel secretly with the bag man for the Saudi royal family to arrange the commissions from the latest Al Yamama deal. Jonathan Aitken said, rubbish, I'm going to sue you for libel. He had to resign. He sued for libel and he lost because Mohammed Fayed turned up the receipt that Jonathan Aitken had paid for in the Ritz Hotel. Okay, so here is Mohammed Fayed pursuing exactly the same agenda as Ari Ben-Menashe, trying to target and blackmail British politicians because of their pro-Arab, pro-Palestine arms deal slot. Let's just deal with the Jonathan Aitken story. When Jonathan Aitken was finally failed in his lawsuit, Mohammed Fayed was all over the British press saying, this is absolutely wonderful. This is fantastic. I have exposed the British Conservative Party. I wrote to him saying, fine, could you tell me if you know Hugh Simmons? And by the way, and as God is my witness, I wrote to him in these terms. Jed, I wrote to him and said, I'm going to tell you, I've done some research into these Middle Eastern arms deals and into these Middle Eastern troubleshooters and middlemen and bagmen. I think you're a pretty brave man going out there and threatening to expose these people. Expose Jonathan Aitken, he's a British gentleman, but exposing these arms middlemen in the Middle East, probably not a good thing to do. Besides which I said, there's an understanding with the Ritz Hotel in Paris. Since the Second World War, the Ritz Hotel has been a safe zone for intelligence operations and arms deals. It's like Las Vegas. Whatever happens in the Ritz Hotel in Paris stays in the Ritz Hotel in Paris. So I said on two levels, you're probably annoying a lot of people saying you're going to be revealing what you discovered in the Ritz Hotel. So I wrote this letter. That was July of, I believe, 1991, was it? And I may have the year wrong. A month later, Diana died in the car crash in Paris. And her boyfriend in the car was, as you quite rightly say, Dodi. And I am, I believe, the only person in the world who says that Diana was not the target. Dodi was.
Very interesting. Yeah. And we know Dodi's father is adamant about this assassination, by the way. He says there's no accident. And he's
well, he is, but he points the finger at the wrong people. And the reason he does that is because he wants to deflect attention to him. Again, Ari is connected because in Gideon Thomas's book, Ari has a section where he says, oh yes, we were involved in that. Somebody once said of Ari Ben-Menashe that if he could possibly say that he was responsible for the Gettysburg Address, he would. He's everywhere. Yeah, clearly Ari Ben-Menashe has credibility because people still use him. But he also peddles some stuff that's not true.
You wanted to tell me about Ari Paul. Who is Ari Paul?
Yeah, Henry Paul. Henry Paul. Henry Paul was the driver of the Dodi Diana car that ended up in the tunnel. And just to remind your listeners, because heck, they had a little commercial break, they went off and had a shower, they may have forgotten. What we're really trying to do is make the connection between England in the 80s, which is what my book Mackie's Hammer is about, and the events of this past week, Ghislaine Maxwell, Geoff Epstein. What on earth is the connection? If they've been listening to the first half of the show, they will have got the connection. All roads lead back to the 80s in the UK, and Ari Ben-Menashe, according to my book, and I was talking to him between 1993 and 1998, as a consequence of those conversations, what we are seeing being suggested about Ghislaine Maxwell and Geoff Epstein was precisely his modus operandum in the 80s in England when he was working with the subject of my book, Hugh Simmons CVE, and with Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father. And it is my suggestion that what Ghislaine and Geoff Epstein were doing flowed from what Ari Ben-Menashe was doing with Robert Maxwell. So to understand and give credibility to the allegations about Ghislaine, you have to look at Ari and what he was doing with Robert Maxwell and Hugh Simmons back in the 80s.
Well, I have a quick question. Yes. I apologize. Victor Ostrovsky.
Yes. Oh.
You know the name, right? Now, how does he fit? He wrote a book talking about this kind of blackmail and deception. Now, how does he fit into all this that you're aware of?
Wow. Interesting point. How does he fit in?
Because I may know some things you don't know.
No, I answer that with a question. Why on earth was Ari wandering around Europe and latterly the United States, although he can't come in to the United States? Why was he wandering around doing things for the Israeli intelligence? Why were they doing this stuff? Victor Ostrovsky wrote 2 books. The first book described all the shenanigans that Israeli intelligence got up to. His second book then said the first book was part of a political battle going on in Israel. Israel is a strange country. You know, it exists on a knife edge because of the countries around it, many of whom still want to destroy Israel. It is highly politicized, every part of it. We're used in this country and in the United Kingdom to a bureaucracy that is supposed to be non-politicized. No, not so in Israel. Every part of Israeli life is politicized, so that when you have a parliamentary balance, so many to the right wing, so many to the left wing, so many to the center, that is supposed to be reflected throughout the bureaucracy and also in the intelligence agencies. So the left wing of Israeli intelligence had been predominant in Israeli affairs up until the end of the late 70s, when Menachem Begin, the Likud prime minister, came to power. And since then, pretty much the right wing have dominated Israeli affairs. But in the 70s and the 80s, there was this battle between the left wing and the right wing in Israeli politics. The left wing, represented by Victor Ostrovsky, according to him, was saying, this is a Middle East battle. This is between us and the Arabs and the Palestinians. We keep it at home. The right wing, Likud, and people like Ari Ben-Menashe, who was very senior in that effort, said, no. The Palestinians are bombing planes and killing Israelis in Munich. There are foreign governments who are tilting towards Arab. These are all fair targets, and we will now take it abroad. So Victor Ostrovsky in his second book said, what I was trying to do with my first book is evidence what the right wing are doing. And there was this battle between the Ostrovskys and the Ben-Menashes, which is how Ben-Menashe ended up in a New York jail in the early 90s, because somebody slipped something to somebody from the wrong part of Israeli intelligence and got him put in jail. And Ari Ben-Menashe got out of jail and got annoyed, so he then engineered the revelations about Oliver North, because Oliver North was working with the left-wing part of Israeli intelligence. That's how I know about Victor Ostrovsky.
Okay, did you know that Victor Ostrovsky published a book for Conchita Sarnoff called Trafficking about Jeffrey Epstein?
No.
And that's, kind of, and Sarnoff was very close friends with Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell, but she hangs out down there at Mar-a-Lago, and this book totally excuses Trump of any kind of connection. In fact, she came on my show and misquoted Trump several times. But what do you make of that, of Victor Ostrovsky publishing an anti-Epstein book from someone that doesn't appear to be all that anti-Epstein?
Well, it's interesting that I mentioned what Victor Ostrovsky had done with his first book,
right,
which was basically propaganda. It's what you and I and serious investigators and journalists have to do the whole time, Ed, which is look at stuff, set it in context, consider it, get other people to talk to get a balanced view about these things. Oh, and I'm going to take a moment to give you a plug. Because, as I said, we spend a lot of time looking at the crazies, and they give people like you and me a bad name. And when people come to me and say, well, okay, you say these people are crazy, where do we start? You start with sensible investigators and sensible journalists, and I tell them one person you can start with is Ed Opperman. Because, Ed, the reason I've been on your show now 4 or 5 times is because you are a serious investigator. You don't just produce comic strips on a Sunday afternoon on Rumble and Telegram. You do serious investigation, you get serious people on, and you ask them challenging questions. So thank you. And anybody listening who hears me say that should immediately go to Patreon.
Oh, Patreon.
And contribute, because Ed needs the money.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Ed needs the money. He's trying to put a daughter through college, people. So, yes, we are the serious people. Right, but we have to do the work. So what do I say about that? Trump. You have to weigh it, you have to balance it. I'm not surprised. You see, I'm going to get back to, I'm going to come back to that question.
Sure.
I want to get back to Henri Paul, and you may say, why? Because in Gideon Thomas's book, Ari Ben-Menashe went out of his way to track down Gideon Thomas and say, we know what happened, because Henri Paul was a Mossad agent. Oh, yeah, really? And we had targeted him to set up the crash. We poisoned him or whatever. And I spent some time in my book saying, okay, I love Ari to death. He's really quite a lovable guy, although dangerous. But this is rubbish. This is simply not true, and I set out a great detail why it's not true. Why would he do this? To distract attention from Mohammed Fayed. Why? Because I believe Mohammed Fayed to be an undisclosed asset of Mossad. It's propaganda. Why exactly would this guy write this anti-Epstein book, which doesn't seem to be all that anti-Epstein? Yeah. I don't know. You see, I don't know. I'm going to be talking about how the whole emphasis of what Ari was doing shifted from the UK to the US. But I have to say that the further you get away from Robert Maxwell, it becomes less important. According to Ari Ben-Menashe, he recruited Ghislaine Maxwell, first of all, in the early 80s, because she was Robert Maxwell's daughter, because she had a lot of contacts. He says in his interviews, he was asked, did they do anything? He said, not at first. I just didn't. She had contacts in America. She might have proved useful. Then through her, we recruited Geoff Epstein. Was Epstein important? He became important, he said in his sing-song voice, because, he knew a lot of people, and we thought it might come in useful. Why did it come in useful? Because after the 80s, the focus shifted from the United Kingdom to the United States. United States started supplying arms to the Middle East. The Israelis became concerned about some of the shift, pro-Palestinian, pro-Arab shift in the United States. Suddenly, the Israelis wanted to target politicians and people in the United States. At the same time, the whole money laundering business that he had been engaged with in Europe also shifted. Hugh Simmons was killed. He had to be replaced as a financial advisor to Robert Maxwell. He was replaced by somebody called Bill Browder. Then Robert Maxwell fell afoul of whoever, and he turned up dead. So the Israelis and others, the Israelis, the Russians, the Russian mob, all the people with money in Eastern Europe, needed somebody else to launder money from them. And this is when Donald Trump, in the early 90s, started massively laundering money for the Russian mob and for Russian leaders. Don't take my word for it. Go onto Facebook, follow the links in the story I've written in conjunction with this interview. You will get back to what's called the laundromat, and it gives details of the 30 years of money laundering that Donald Trump did for the Russians. The story, not that Robert Mueller missed, the story Mueller came across and got scared by, which is why he ended up doing nothing, because it terrified him. The man has children. So when you come down to Mar-a-Lago and you say, why was the story being written that was anti-Epstein but not anti-Epstein? It is important to understand that Ari Ben-Menashe shifted the emphasis in the 80s from the United Kingdom to the United States. into the last couple of decades, and the focus for money laundering became not Robert Maxwell, but Donald Trump, especially with relation to Eastern Europe and Russia, and the Russian mob boss, who's a guy called Semyon Moyelevich, which is spelt Mogilevich, but it's pronounced Moyelevich. And Semyon Moyelevich is the connection between all of them.
Geoff, let me ask you this, because we're running out of time. We only have about 6 or 7 minutes, right? So I want to have you come back. I want to have you come back this week and really flesh all this out, because we're going in so many different directions. There's a lot of stuff here. But do you think that Ari Ben-Menashe may be responsible for the death of Maxwell?
In my opinion, yes.
Okay.
Ari Ben-Menashe, when you speak with him, is this cuddly, high-pitched guy. I went and had dinner with him and his wife in Montreal in 1993. Lovely man. Lovely, lovely man. But twice I made him angry and I saw the steel. And the first time I made him angry was when I was on about the 6th or 7th floor of a hotel in Montreal. And he had been selling me this line that we have Hugh Simmons on our list. We found out about Hugh Simmons here. We found out about Hugh Simmons there. And I looked him in the eye and said, could we stop? You must have known Hugh Simmons personally. And the fun Ari was gone. And the steely-eyed Ari was there. And I was like counting how many floors up we were. And he said, why do you say that? And I said, well, you keep saying that he did business with Robert Maxwell, and you did not business with Robert Maxwell. You must have been in the same room together. And that's when he finally admitted they had been in the same room. And then he said, well, and he was back to his sing-song voice. Yes, but he wasn't using that name. And the moment passed. Ari Ben-Menashe will constantly put the blame on other people unless he wants to claim some credit for himself. But he is a very frightening individual. I believe he was responsible for the death of Robert Maxwell. Yep. I believe he was responsible for the death of Hugh Simmons. And if you pay close attention to the interview he gives, I suspect he was also responsible for the death of Geoff Epstein.
Right, I was going to say that. Right, now what do you make of that? The Geoff Epstein demise? You think he's dead, or was he walked out?
I know only what you know.
Yeah.
And I would say this, and your earlier guest Hoffenberg probably has more to say about this. But if you look at the end of the 80s, there was a lot of cleaning up. A lot of companies went bust. A lot of people turned up dead, including Robert Maxwell and Hugh Simmons. It is absolutely modus operandum for intelligence agencies who are serious. Serious intelligence agencies are Britain, France, Israel, Russia, not really the CIA. Serious intelligence agencies clean up after themselves. Epstein knew too much. Why Ghislaine Maxwell is still alive, why she was put on trial, I have no clue.
Yeah. We got about 4 minutes left. What about all the blackmail juice that Maxwell must know in her head, at least? Why not use some of that? What's going on?
I suspect that Ghislaine Maxwell was offered a deal, and for whatever reason, she didn't feel it was enough to stop her prosecution. I suspect that she will be offered much the same deal now that sentencing is up. I do remember reading this about Jeffrey Epstein, and you've probably come across this too, that Alexander Acosta, who was Trump's first Labor secretary, was the gentleman who arranged the prosecution deal in 2007 with Geoff Epstein, and he is alleged by the Daily Beast to have told the Trump transition team that he arranged that deal because he was approached by somebody senior and credible and told to back off because Geoff Epstein was intelligence. So I'm not surprised he was cleaned up. I believe that Ghislaine Maxwell has stuff to sell in her sentencing. I would not invest heavily in a future that says Ghislaine Maxwell will be alive in 2 years' time.
Yeah, because you can imagine what she knows. She probably does know about the death of Princess Diana and the death of her father and all these things. Yeah.
I think she knows an awful lot.
Yeah.
As I say, I'm not surprised. I am surprised she's still alive. I am surprised they took her to trial.
So, Geoff, we've got about 2 minutes left. What do you want to leave us with? And I want you to come back this week. We can get you back as soon as we can.
I think the important point, and it is a plug, because I didn't set out in 1988 when my friend died to do all of this. But now that I've done all of this, I would say to people who are confused by what is going on, whether it's Ghislaine Maxwell, Geoff Epstein, what happened in Afghanistan, what Trump was up to, what Hillary was up to, if you truly want to understand what is going on now in America and around the world and in Great Britain, you have to understand the 80s. If you want to understand the 80s, you have to understand the United Kingdom. And the best roadmap for understanding the 80s is my book, Maggie's Hammer. There. I ended up with a nice plug.
No, excellent.
And I will happily come back. I always suggest that when I come back, you have some subjects you want to quiz me about, and I'll let you map out the territory rather than me.
I don't know, man. There's just so much here, you know. But Maggie's Hammer, how investigating the mysterious death of my friend uncovered a netherworld of illegal arms deals, political slush funds, high-level corruption, secret role as America's hired gun. That's by Jeffrey Gilson, and you can find him under Geoff Gilson, either on his Facebook page. And like he said, he goes over this stuff in detail on Facebook and also on tickertapetalk.com, Geoff Gilson. Mr. Gilson, thank you so much.
My pleasure. You have a good day now.
You too, brother. Happy New Year.